The crowd was screaming. Over 3,000 people filled the palace square that cold November morning. Their voices echoed off the ancient stone walls like thunder. Signs were raised high. Fists punched the air. Anger rippled through the mass of bodies like a living thing. And there, standing alone at the palace gates, was a single royal guard. His name was Thomas Wren, 42 years old. 20 years of service. A man who had never broken protocol, never raised his voice, never stepped out of line. He stood perfectly still in his ceremonial uniform red coat, black boots, white gloves, as the wave of fury rolled toward him. The protests had begun 2 days earlier. A new law had been passed without warning. Families were losing their homes. Jobs were disappearing overnight. People felt betrayed, forgotten, and now they wanted answers. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. The palace had been warned. Security reports said the protest would be big, maybe a few hundred people. But no one expected this. No one expected thousands, and no one expected them to march straight to the palace gates with such rage in their hearts. Thomas could see the front line now. Young faces, old faces, mothers holding children, men with clenched jaws. They were 50 feet away, then 40, then 30 behind him. The palace doors were locked. The other guards had been pulled inside an hour ago. Orders from above. Secure the building. Let no one through. But Thomas had been on gate duty when the order came. And somehow, in the chaos of the lockdown, he'd been left outside. Alone, his radio crackled. "Wren, get inside now." But there was no time. The crowd was 20 feet away. The noise was deafening. He could feel the ground shaking beneath his boots. Thomas did not move. He had been trained for many things, ceremonies, parades, standing perfectly still for hours while tourists took photos. But this was different. This was real. A woman in the front broke away from the crowd. She was middle-aged, tears streaming down her face. She came right up to Thomas and stopped inches from him. "My daughter," she said, her voice cracking. "She's only 7. We're losing our home. Where is she supposed to sleep?" Thomas looked into her eyes. He saw pain there, desperation, not violence. Not hatred, just hurt. The crowd pressed closer. More voices joined hers. "They don't care about us. We want answers. Let us through." Someone threw a bottle. It smashed against the palace wall behind Thomas, glass exploding across the cobblestones. He didn't flinch. The energy was shifting. The crowd was no longer just angry. They were on the edge of something worse. Thomas could feel it. One wrong move, one spark, and everything would burn. His captain's voice screamed through the radio again. "Wren, stand down. Return to your post inside immediately." But Thomas stayed exactly where he was, because he saw something the people inside the palace could not see. He saw faces. Real people, not a mob, not a threat. Just humans who were afraid and broken and desperate to be heard. And in that moment, Thomas Wren made a choice that would change everything. He slowly raised both hands. Not in surrender, not in defense. Just ... open. The crowd fell silent. Thousands of people, suddenly still, watching this one man in his red coat standing alone before them. And then Thomas did something no one expected. He began to speak. "I hear you." His voice wasn't loud, but somehow in that moment of silence it carried. People in the front rows leaned in. Those behind them pushed forward, trying to listen. "I hear you," Thomas said again, louder this time. "And I'm sorry." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Confusion, surprise. This wasn't what anyone expected from a palace guard. They weren't supposed to speak. They weren't supposed to show emotion. They were supposed to be statues, symbols, nothing more. But Thomas wasn't nothing more. He was a man, a father, a neighbor, and he understood their pain better than they knew. "I have a daughter too," he continued, his voice steady but full of feeling. "She's 9. I know what it's like to worry about her future. To lie awake at night wondering if I'm doing enough, if I'm protecting her the way I should." The woman who had spoken first wiped her eyes. Others in the crowd began to lower their signs. "Not all of them, not yet. But enough. Can't change the law," Thomas said. "I wish I could, but I can't. I'm just a guard. I follow orders. I stand at this gate and I do my job."
Ow.
Someone shouted from the back. "Then you're part of the problem." Thomas nodded slowly. "Maybe I am. But I'm also standing here right now, looking at all of you, and I see my neighbors. My community. People I would protect with my life if I had to." He took a breath. The wind had picked up. His red coat billowed slightly. The crowd waited. "This palace," Thomas said, gesturing behind him without turning around, "has stood for 300 years. Kings and queens have come and gone. Laws have been written and rewritten. But you know what never changes? People. People like you. People like me. We're still here. We're still fighting. We're still trying to make things better." A young man near the front shouted, "Then why won't they listen?" "Because they're afraid," Thomas said simply. "Just like you are. Just like I am." The radio on his belt crackled again. The captain's voice was furious now. "Ren, what the hell are you doing? Get inside now or you're finished." Thomas reached down and turned the radio off. The crowd noticed. Some cheered. Others looked uncertain. The woman with the 7-year-old daughter stared at him with something like hope in her eyes. "I'm turning off my radio," Thomas said, "because I want to listen to you instead. Not to my orders. Not to protocols. Just to you." He stepped forward. One step, then another, until he was standing in the middle of the crowd. This was forbidden. This was dangerous. If something went wrong, if violence erupted, he would be crushed in seconds. He had no protection. No backup. Nothing. But Thomas didn't stop. He walked deeper into the mass of people. They parted for him, creating a narrow path. Some reached out to touch his shoulder as he passed. Others just watched in stunned silence. Thomas stopped in the center of the square. Thousands of people surrounded him on all sides. The palace was far behind him now. He was completely exposed. Completely vulnerable. He turned in a slow circle, looking at every face he could see. "Tell me your stories," he said. "One at a time. I'm listening." For a long moment, no one moved. The tension hung in the air like a held breath, and then the woman with the 7-year-old daughter stepped forward. "My name is Sarah," she said quietly. "We've lived in our home for 12 years. My husband died 3 years ago. I've been working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. And now they're telling me we have 60 days to leave. I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do." Thomas looked at her. Really looked at her. Not as a threat. Not as a problem. As a human being who deserved dignity. "Thank you for telling me, Sarah," he said. "Your story matters." Another voice spoke up. Then another. Then another. People began sharing their pain, their fear, their anger. And Thomas stood there, in the middle of it all, listening to every single word. What was happening in that square was something no one could have predicted, something that shouldn't have been possible. But sometimes, in the darkest moments, all it takes is one person willing to be human. Inside the palace, panic had taken hold. Ministers rushed through marble hallways. Security chiefs barked orders into phones. Camera feeds showed the impossible scene unfolding outside a royal guard standing in the middle of an angry crowd, talking to them like neighbors at a town meeting. "Get him out of there," the head of security shouted. "Send a team. Extract him now." But the captain of the guard, a stern man named Harrison, held up his hand. Wait. The security chief looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "He's violated every protocol we have. He's put himself in danger. He's making us look weak." Harrison stared at the screen. He'd served with Thomas for 15 years. He knew the man, knew his character, and something in his gut told him to watch what happened next. Outside, more stories were being told. An elderly man spoke about losing his pension. A young couple talked about their canceled wedding because they could no longer afford the venue. A father explained how his son's school was closing. Each story was different, but they all carried the same weight, the same pain, and Thomas listened to every single one. He didn't make promises. He didn't offer solutions. He simply gave them something they hadn't received in months: attention, respect, the feeling that someone in power actually cared. But not everyone in the crowd was satisfied. Near the back, a group of younger protesters were growing restless. They hadn't come to talk. They'd come to be heard, to make an impact. And watching one guard have a conversation felt like a betrayal of their anger. One of them, a man named Marcus, pushed forward through the crowd. He was 23, unemployed, full of rage at a system that had chewed him up and spit him out. "This is a waste of time," Marcus shouted as he broke through to the front. "He's stalling us. He's keeping us busy while they prepare to shut us down." The crowd murmured. Some agreed. The energy began to shift again. Thomas turned to face Marcus. The young man's jaw was clenched. His fists were tight. He was ready to explode. "You're right," Thomas said calmly. Marcus blinked. "What?" "You're right," Thomas repeated. "I can't change anything standing here. I can't fix your situation. I'm just one person in a uniform. And why are you wasting our time?" Marcus demanded. "Because," Thomas said, stepping closer, "sometimes being heard is the first step to being helped. And you haven't been heard. Not really. Not by the people who matter." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "And you think you matter?" "No," Thomas said honestly. "But I know people who do. And I'm going to make sure they hear your stories. All of them." "How?" Someone shouted from the crowd. "You're just a guard." Thomas turned in a circle again, meeting as many eyes as he could. "You're right. I'm just a guard. But I've been inside those walls for 20 years. I know the people who make decisions. I know their assistants, their schedulers, the people who control their calendars and their attention, and I'm going to use every connection I have to make sure what happened here today gets to them. And if they ignore you?" Marcus challenged. Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Then I'll stand with you again. And again. Until they can't ignore us anymore." The crowd went quiet. Something in Thomas's voice, the certainty, the sincerity cut through the doubt. Sarah, the woman with the daughter, spoke up. "But they'll fire you. You'll lose everything." Thomas smiled slightly. It was sad but genuine. "Maybe. But I'll still be able to sleep at night." Can the people behind those palace doors say the same? A ripple of understanding moved through the crowd. This wasn't a tactic. This wasn't a stunt. This was a man choosing his conscience over his career. Marcus stared at Thomas for a long moment. Then, slowly, he lowered his fists. "What do you need from us?" he asked. Thomas thought carefully. "I need you to go home, peacefully today. Give me 3 days. 3 days to take your stories to the people who can make a difference. If nothing changes, come back. I'll be standing here with you. If they arrest you for what you've done today..." Someone asked. "And they arrest me," Thomas said simply. "But your stories will still be told." "I'll make sure of it." The crowd exchanged glances. Whispers spread. Some people were nodding. Others looked skeptical. But the anger, the burning, destructive rage had cooled. Marcus extended his hand. Thomas shook it, firm, respectful. 3 days, Marcus said. "But if you're lying to us..." "I'm not," Thomas interrupted gently. "I promise you, I'm not." One by one, people began to leave the square. Not running. Not storming off. Just walking away, talking quietly among themselves. But something had changed in them. Something important. Within an hour, the square was empty. 3,000 people had dissolved into the city streets. No violence, no arrests, no broken windows or burned cars. Just silence where chaos had stood. Thomas walked slowly back toward the palace gates. His legs felt heavy. His heart was pounding. The adrenaline that had kept him steady was draining away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. The palace doors opened. Captain Harrison stood there, his expression unreadable. Inside, he said quietly, Now, Thomas followed him through corridors he'd walked for 2 decades. Past portraits of kings and queens who'd never known what it felt like to stand alone before an angry crowd. Past decorative armor and velvet ropes, and all the symbols of power that felt hollow now. They entered a conference room. 12 people sat around a long table. Ministers, advisors, the head of palace security. All of them staring at Thomas like he was a bomb that might go off. "Sit," the security chief said. Thomas remained standing. "I'd prefer not to, sir. That wasn't a request." "I understand, sir, but I've been standing all morning. I'd like to continue standing." It was a small act of defiance. Quiet, polite, but everyone in the room felt it. The Minister of Public Affairs, a woman named Victoria Ashford, leaned forward. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, known for being difficult to impress. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas said. "I listened to people who needed to be heard." "You violated protocol," the security chief snapped. "You endangered yourself and others. You made unauthorized statements to a hostile crowd. You turned off your radio and ignored direct orders. Do you understand the severity of these actions?" "I do, sir." "Then you understand you'll be dismissed from service immediately." Thomas nodded slowly. He'd expected this, prepared for it. "I understand. Wait." Victoria held up a hand. The security chief looked at her in surprise. She kept her eyes on Thomas. "What exactly did you promise those people that I would bring?" "Their stories to the people who could make a difference," Thomas said. "That they would be heard. That if nothing changed in 3 days, I would stand with them again." "You promised to join a protest against the palace," the security chief said incredulously. "Against your own employer." "I promised to stand with my community," Thomas corrected. "Because that's what they are. Not enemies. Not a mob. Right. Just people who are suffering." Victoria studied him carefully. "And you believe we should listen to them?" "I believe they deserve to be heard," Thomas said. "What you do with their stories after that is your decision. But yes, ma'am, I believe you should listen." She sat back in her chair, quiet, thinking. Captain Harrison, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "If I may, Minister Ashford." She nodded. "Thomas Wren has served with distinction for 20 years, Harrison said. "Perfect record. Not a single complaint. He's been commended 4 times for excellence. He trains new recruits. He volunteers at the Veterans Hospital every Sunday. If he felt the need to break protocol today, perhaps we should ask ourselves why." The security chief looked ready to argue, but Victoria raised her hand again. "How many people were in that square?" she asked. "Over 3,000, ma'am," Harrison replied. "And how many were arrested? How many injuries? How much property damage?" Harrison paused. "None, ma'am." She let that sink in. The room went quiet. "One guard," Victoria said slowly, "stopped a riot before it started. Not with force, not with threats. With words. With empathy." She looked at Thomas. "That's what you did, isn't it?" Thomas hesitated. "I just talked to them, ma'am. Human to human. And in doing so, you prevented what could have been a disaster." She looked around the table. Every one of us was preparing for violence today, for injuries, for headlines that would damage the palace's reputation for years. And this man, this guard, who supposedly violated every protocol, gave us peace instead. The security chief cleared his throat. "With all respect, Minister, he still broke direct orders." "He saved lives," Victoria said flatly, including possibly his own. "That takes more courage than following orders ever will." She stood. The others at the table watched her carefully. Victoria Ashford was known as someone who didn't make impulsive decisions. But something in her expression had changed. "Thomas Wren," she said formally, "you will not be dismissed. Instead, you're being temporarily reassigned. Effective immediately, you will report directly to me." Thomas blinked. "Ma'am, you promised those people their stories would be heard. I'm going to make sure you keep that promise. You have 3 days to compile testimonies, organize the information, and present it to a special committee. I'll make sure the right people are in that room." "Can't be serious," the security chief said. Victoria turned to him. Her voice was ice. This palace exists because of the people outside these walls. We've forgotten that. Thomas Wren remembered, and I'll be damned if I let us make that mistake again. She looked back at Thomas. We'll have support, resources, whatever you need. But understand this. If you're wrong, if this blows up in our faces, you'll take the fall. Alone. I understand, ma'am. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Victoria said. You've got 72 hours to change minds that have been closed for decades. That's not a gift. That's a test. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat at a borrowed desk in a small palace office, surrounded by notebooks and recordings. He'd spent the afternoon tracking down people from the protest. Sarah, with the 7-year-old daughter. Marcus, the young man who'd challenged him. The elderly man who'd lost his pension. Dozens of others. Each conversation was the same. Surprised that he'd actually followed through. Cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, something could change. And story after story of people falling through the cracks of a system that had forgotten them. By midnight, Thomas had 37 detailed testimonies. By 3 in the morning, he had 62. He wrote everything down in clear, simple language. No politics. No blame. Just facts. Real people with real problems that needed real solutions. His daughter called at 6. She was 9, still half asleep. Dad? Mom said you were on TV. Thomas smiled tiredly. Yeah, sweetheart. I was. She said you were really brave. His throat tightened. I just did what felt right. Are you coming home soon? He looked at the papers covering his desk. The clock on the wall. The 3 days ticking away. Soon, baby. I promise. Okay. I love you, Dad. I love you too. The next 2 days blurred together. Thomas worked with a small team Victoria had assigned to him. They organized the testimonies by theme: housing, employment, education, healthcare. They created summaries. They prepared visual presentations. They did everything possible to make the information impossible to ignore. But Thomas knew the real challenge wasn't the presentation, it was the audience. On the 3rd day, he stood outside a grand chamber deep in the palace. Inside, 20 of the most powerful people in the government waited. Ministers, policymakers, people who shaped the laws that governed millions of lives. Captain Harrison appeared beside him. Ready? Thomas adjusted his uniform. He was wearing his ceremonial dress again. Red coat, white gloves. The armor of duty. No, Thomas said honestly. But I'm going in anyway. Harrison put a hand on his shoulder. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. What you did out there, I've never seen anything like it. I just talked to people, Captain. You did more than that. You reminded everyone what we're supposed to be protecting. Not walls. Not protocols, people. Thomas nodded, took a breath, and walked through the doors. The chamber was intimidating. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, portraits of stern-faced leaders from centuries past. The 20 people seated in a semicircle looked at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Victoria Ashford sat at the center. She gestured to a podium. Mr. Wren, you have 30 minutes. Begin. Thomas stepped to the podium. His hands were shaking slightly. He gripped the edges to steady himself. 3 days ago, he began, I stood in a square with over 3,000 angry people. They came to the palace, demanding to be heard. And I realized something. They weren't angry because they wanted to be. They were angry because they were scared. Let that settle. I've spent the last 72 hours listening to their stories. I want to share some of them with you now. For the next 25 minutes, Thomas spoke. He told Sarah's story, Marcus's story, the elderly man's story. He shared numbers, families losing homes, children losing schools, workers losing jobs, but he never let the numbers become abstract. He kept bringing it back to people. Real faces, real lives. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Others took notes. A few stared at him with open skepticism. When he finished, the room was silent. Finally, one of the ministers spoke. His name was Gerald Hatch, and he was known for being pragmatic to the point of coldness. Mr. Wren, Hatch said, what you've presented is certainly compelling. But you must understand policy decisions are complex. We can't simply reverse a law because people are upset. I'm not asking you to reverse it, sir, Thomas said. I'm asking you to amend it. To add protections for the people falling through the cracks, transition periods, support programs, things that would cost a fraction of what we'd spend managing continued unrest. Another minister, a woman named Ellen Price, leaned forward. You're a guard, Mr. Wren. No disrespect. But what makes you qualified to suggest policy solutions? Thomas met her eyes. I'm not qualified, ma'am. But the people I talk to they're living this. They know what they need. I'm just delivering their message. And if we do nothing? Hatch asked. What then? More protests? More disruption? I promised them I'd stand with them if nothing changed, Thomas said. And I will. But that's not a threat, sir. It's a fact. Because they're not going away. Their problems aren't going away. And ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. It just makes them angrier. The room fell silent again. Victoria stood. I think we've heard enough. Mr. Wren, please wait outside. We'll deliberate. Thomas bowed slightly and left the chamber. His legs felt weak. He'd done everything he could. Said everything that needed to be said. Now it was out of his hands. He sat on a bench in the corridor, staring at the floor, wondering if he'd just ended his career for nothing. 2 hours passed. Thomas sat on that bench, watching shadows move across the marble floor. His mind kept drifting back to the square, to Sarah's face, to Marcus's anger, to all those people who were counting on him to do the impossible. Finally, the doors opened. Victoria stepped out. Her expression was unreadable. Come with me, she said. Thomas followed her down the corridor, away from the chamber. They walked in silence until they reached a window overlooking the city. Thousands of buildings stretched to the horizon. Millions of lives, either very brave or very foolish, Victoria said quietly. I haven't decided which. Thomas said nothing. She turned to face him. The committee deliberated for 90 minutes. There was significant resistance. Several ministers wanted to dismiss your presentation entirely. Gerald Hatch called it emotional manipulation. Thomas's heart sank. But Victoria continued. Ellen Price pointed out that everything you presented was factual, verifiable, and that ignoring facts doesn't make them go away. She made a motion to form a task force to review the law and propose amendments. Thomas looked at her, afraid to hope. The motion passed, Victoria said. 14-6. For a moment, Thomas couldn't speak. They're actually going to do something? Don't celebrate yet, Victoria warned. This is just the beginning. A task force doesn't guarantee change. It guarantees consideration. Real change will take months, maybe years. And there's no promise that the amendments will be what people want, but it's something, Thomas said. It's more than they had 3 days ago. Victoria nodded slowly. Yes, it's something. She paused. There's one condition. The task force wants community representatives involved. People who can speak to the real impact of any proposed changes. They want you to help select those representatives. Thomas blinked. Me, you're the only person those protesters trust. You made promises. Now you need to help keep them. She looked at him seriously. This is going to be hard. Messy. There will be setbacks. Compromises that feel like betrayals. Are you prepared for that? Thomas thought about his daughter. About Sarah? About Marcus? About all the people who'd shared their pain with him because he'd been willing to listen. Yes, ma'am, he said. I'm prepared. Victoria studied him for a long moment. Then she extended her hand. Good. Because you're not going back to gate duty. You're being reassigned permanently. Community liaison to the palace. It's a new position. You'll be the bridge between the people outside these walls and the people inside them. Thomas shook her hand. His eyes were stinging. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me. This job will probably make your life significantly harder, but someone needs to do it. and you've already proven you're willing to stand alone when it matters. That evening, Thomas returned to the square. Word had spread quickly. News vans were there, cameras and people. Hundreds of them, Sarah. Marcus, the elderly man, all waiting to hear what had happened. Thomas stood at the gates again, but this time he wasn't alone. Victoria Ashford stood beside him, and Captain Harrison, and 3 other officials who'd never set foot in the square before. The crowd quieted as Thomas raised his hand. 3 days ago, he called out, I promised you that your stories would be heard. Today, I'm here to tell you that they were. A task force has been formed. Representatives from your community will be included. Change won't happen overnight, but it will happen. Because you didn't give up. Because you showed up. Because you made your voices impossible to ignore. Someone in the crowd shouted, What if they're lying? Marcus stepped forward. He looked at Thomas. Then at Victoria. Then back at the crowd. Kept his promise, Marcus said loudly. He did exactly what he said he would. Maybe we should give them the chance to do the same. Slowly, people began to nod. It wasn't celebration. It wasn't total trust. But it was a beginning. Sarah approached Thomas. Tears were streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for seeing us. Thomas felt his own eyes water. Thank you for trusting me. As the crowd began to disperse, Victoria leaned toward Thomas. You realize this is only the first battle, right? There will be others. And they won't all end this well. I know, Thomas said. But today ended well. That's enough for now. Over the following months, the task force met weekly. Community representatives including Marcus and Sarah sat at tables with ministers and policy experts. The conversations were difficult, sometimes heated, but they happened. And slowly, amendments began to take shape. Not everyone was happy. Some protesters felt the changes didn't go far enough. Some politicians felt they went too far. But compromises were made. Protections were added. Transition periods were extended. Support programs were funded. 6 months after that morning in the square, the amended law was passed. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Families like Sarah's received additional time and assistance. Programs were created to help people find new jobs. Schools received emergency funding to stay open. Thomas stood in the palace one evening, looking out at the city again. His daughter was with him this time. He'd brought her to see where he worked, where he fought quiet battles every day to make sure people were heard. Dad, she said, tugging his hand, did you really stop a whole protest by yourself? Thomas knelt down to her level. No, sweetheart, I didn't stop it. I listened to it. There's a difference. He smiled. Stopping something means you end it. Listening means you understand it. And understanding is how you actually fix things. She thought about that. So listening is more important than stopping? Always, Thomas said. Always. Years later, when people told the story of the protests that never turned violent, they'd talk about the royal guard who stood alone before 3,000 angry people. They'd talk about his courage, his compassion, his willingness to break every rule to do what was right. But Thomas knew the truth. He hadn't been alone. Not really. He'd been surrounded by thousands of people who simply needed someone to see them as human beings instead of problems to be solved. And in the end, that was all it took. One person willing to listen, and 3,000 people willing to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could be heard. Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't standing against the crowd. It's standing with them. And that's exactly what Thomas Wren did.